Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present LChayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and on this edition of LChayim, I have the wonderful pleasure to be sitting with two of my favorite people in the world, each of whom has made an enormous contribution to Jewish life, and each of whom is now among the most brilliant, articulate, and insightful observers and analysts and commentators on the world Jewish scene today. If you watch Shalom TV often, you know them both very well. It's always a joy to have at this table Izzy Lieberman, who for more than 25 years in the 1970s and 80s was the foremost leader of the Jewish community of Australia and was a pioneer in the Soviet Jewry movement, being the first to bring the issue before the United Nations. Izzy made Aliyah in 1999 and is currently a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and for Israel Hayom. And if you're not receiving Izzy's weekly column online, do yourself a favor and visit the website Word from Jerusalem and sign up to receive Izzy Lieberman's columns, which are entitled Candidly Speaking from Jerusalem. And Izzy, it's wonderful to have you back at this table. Thank you very much.
Great to be back with you, Mark.
Thank you. And we're also joined by an individual who has literally helped to shape American Jewish life over the past 40 years. It's a pleasure to be joined by Eric Yaffi, who for more than 25 years served as the president of the Reform Movement's congregational arm, the Union for Reform Judaism, where Eric led a return to Jewish tradition and became one of the most thoughtful and vocal and often courageous Jewish leaders on the world Jewish scene. Eric retired from that position in 2012, and like Izzy Lieberman, he is now a leading columnist and blogger and analyst of Jewish life, writing for Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, and the Huffington Post. And Eric, it's always wonderful to be with you. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So I get to sit now with the two of you and ask you for you to address some of the issues that have been in the forefront of Jewish life, some of which are controversial. We should say, by the way, in some way, Izzy is center right, Eric is center left. Both of them, again, are part of the mainstream of Jewish life, but they bring slightly different perspectives to bear. I'm very anxious to hear what both Izzy and Eric have to say to each other. I want to begin with an issue that got enormous publicity in the Jewish community. And when I say enormous publicity, I want to also say in preface, you know, Eric, we live in the Eastern Seaboard, in the Eastern Corridor, in what in some way almost is a Jewish enclave. And I have people writing me, Shalom TV, all over the country. And I have one very loyal, wonderful listener, viewer, Linda, out in Seattle, who, writes to me, New York is not the entirety of the Jewish world.
She's right.
She is 100% right. And very often she'll say to me, I'm in Seattle here on the West Coast. I have no idea what you're talking about. The term, the Conference of Presidents, which, for me, it's, there's the New York Yankees, the New York Mets, and the President's Conference. For many American Jews, Izzy, knowing what the President's Conference, let alone the Claims Conference is, it's just, you're talking to people who have no idea the context. So I stop myself when I say to you, what a huge issue came out of the recent President's Conference decision not to admit J Street. For many of us, it was an issue that got a lot of attention. For many American Jews, they have no clue. Not only do they have no clue what the President's Conference is or what the real issues are, when they do see the issue written about however it's written, they have no in-depth understanding of why the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations chose not to give J Street membership at this point in time. Now, you write a piece, Izzy, called The Fake Martyrdom of J Street. And in it, you explain why you support what the President's Conference did by rejecting, or it wasn't rejecting, it was not admitting, not having enough votes to admit the J Street into the President's Conference. I want you to begin by explaining why do you call it the fake martyrdom, and what was your position on whether the conference was correct or incorrect in its decision to, at this point, deny membership to J Street?
Look, to my mind, the issue is not so much the conference as identifying a group that describes itself as being pro-peace, pro-Israel, but above all, insinuating that it's pro-Israel when every single act it's engaged in, with possibly one or two minor exemptions, have been anti-Israel of the worst order. An organization which has been financed by George Soros, who is known to be a powerful anti-Zionist, an organization which says to Israelis, you've elected a democracy, you may be a democracy, but you've elected a group of people who we feel are doing damage. Now, that's perfectly entitled. Anybody's entitled to be critical of a government. But to take it upon themselves to treat Israelis the way a parent treats a drug-addicted child and say, we know what's best for you and we're going to do what's best for you, and then to go to the American government and promote anti-Israeli and anti-government activities on an organized level, that to me is where you draw the line of the big tent. You can have every idea, and I think the good thing about the President's Conference, from what I understand of it, and I'm not an American, so I'm not an expert in it, but it's got everybody from the extreme left to the extreme right. I mean, you've got Shalom Achshav there, but the difference is they don't have organizations which are committed to undermining Israel in this particular context. And this nonsense about being liberal and being pro-Israel and suggesting that AIPAC, for example, is a right-wing organization, an organization which has been created to undo AIPAC, which to my mind, you can have criticisms of it like anything else. But AIPAC has done more to put Israel on the map in a positive sense on the congressional level than any other organization. And this organization has pledged to undo it and to be the alternative to it. It goes to congressmen and it tells them that AIPAC is bad. It has justified the Goldstone report initially. It went further. It actually took Goldstone before he recanted and introduced him to Congress people. Look, only just now it came out and defended the Hamas PA deal. I can go on and on and on. Now, each one of these individually, perhaps you'd say it's a different idea. But when you have a consistent pattern and when you have a war, and you yourself, Eric, you yourself condemned them during the war for the way they behaved, when they really couldn't make up their mind who was in the right, whether it was Israel or Hamas. They couldn't understand and they didn't want to take sides. I mean, this is an organization that is part of the Jewish tent. All I can say to you, if a Jewish tent is going to bring in people like that, it's not a Jewish tent. You're destroying the Jewish tent, not extending it. And I'm very pleased that by a substantial majority, and I think it really came out on party lines. Unfortunately, the Reform movement and its satellites, and the Conservative movements and its satellites, and the Orthodox on the other side and their satellites, there was a polarization. But overall, if you look at the numbers
But we
carefully,
should make sure people understand. Rick Jacobs, who now succeeded Eric and heads the Union for Reform Judaism, he came out very strongly against the President's Conference decision.
That's right.
And even suggested he would consider, by the way, he did not go further than that, but he said he would consider withdrawing from the conference. We should say, incidentally, that the head of the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis.
I was going to say that.
Yes. Rick Block took a very different position.
Yeah.
But you're correct. What you're saying is that there was at least some immediate reaction. Rick Jacobs was very upset with the decision. He was not the only one, is he? By the way, Abe Foxman, the national director of the ADL, who just had this enormous publication where he did a survey of 100 countries and found some real endemic anti-Semitism, and he is not known to be a far-left person in the Jewish community. Even Abe Foxman said, although I was critical of J Street in the past, I think the President's Conference should have included J Street. So I want you to speak to the extent to which there is some real support inside the American Jewish community for including J Street, and whether, does that have any influence on your opinion at all?
No, it certainly has an influence on my opinion. I'm very distressed to see, and Abe Foxman is a guy who I have a very high regard for, but I think that on this, as occasionally he does from time to time, he spoke very, very quickly and should have given it a little bit of thought. How can he support an organization which is paying big money for congressmen who are anti-Israel to be elected? I mean, where does it all fit in? If there's no litmus test, as I think it was Rabbi Jacobs suggested there should be no litmus test, if there's no litmus test, why not bring in Jews for Jesus? Why not bring in Naturah Carter? And I want to remind you, the President's Conference, to their credit, they excluded Kahana's group. What's wrong? I can assure you that Kahana's group is no worse, and I'm saying that in relative terms, at least Kahana's group was, with all its extremism, was not trying to undermine Israel. Here, we're talking about an Alice in Wonderland situation. I cannot understand my liberal friends when they kind of push everything aside. Every single step of the way, J Street has been hostile to Israel. That's not bringing you into a big tent. You destroy a tent when you do that.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was getting just worked up. I love it.
You have strong feelings.
I love it.
In person as well as on paper.
First of all, I should ask you, do you have a feeling about whether the conference should or should not have brought J Street in?
Yes, I wrote a piece saying that they should be admitted.
Okay.
And I speak with some credibility on this issue. As Izzy pointed out, I've been a very open critic of J Street in those cases where I thought they got it wrong. Mm-hmm. And I was the keynote speaker at their first convention.
And you weren't treated very well.
They were unhappy with me because I focused in the initial part of my remarks on their position on the Gaza war, which I thought was wrong, and on their position on gold steel, which I also thought was wrong. But having said that, do I believe that they should be part of the conference? First of all, I do. Do I believe they're an anti-Israel organization? I do not.
Why not?
And first of all, basic premise, 2 states for 2 people. That's the organizing premise.
That doesn't make you a Zionist. I mean, I'm in favor of 2 states for 2 people, too.
Second of all, they've played a very effective role on the BDS issue.
And invited BDS people to their conferences.
Right, look, by the way, I oppose that. Their line was, just to be clear.
Yes, I want to make sure everyone understands. BDS is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that seeks to undermine the legitimacy of the State of Israel. The question that is often asked is, does an organization, does a college campus have people who support BDS, the attempt to delegitimize Israel? Do you have them at a conference? Do you invite them to be speakers? As far as I understand, J Street has never said it is part of the BDS movement, but the criticism is that J Street has invited major people of the BDS movement to be significant speakers at their conference, and that this is somehow a sign of their support of that movement.
Look, that, with respect, that's totally and completely wrong. And that's what accounts for why people, I think, like Abe Foxman and others, I believe the Federation movement also supported their application. The truth is roughly half the community supported their application and half did not. And their rationale, which I disagreed with, was if we're going to fight BDS, we're going to listen to them. We're going to have them come and we're going to listen to what they have to say. But in terms of action on the ground, they have been, in fact, even Malcolm Hunline said this, one of the most effective opponents of BDS on the college campus, because they speak from a perspective of the left, and they have gone out and led the battle in a critical area among a critical audience. Anti-Israel organizations don't do that. They simply don't do that. Look, I read, Izzy, I read your article, and I saw your various disagreements. What was interesting to me, in many cases you were critical of positions, and I understood. I thought the reasons why. You were critical of positions that were and are held by the Obama administration. So let's sort of step back and take a big picture view here.
And for example?
On Iran or on the PA-Hamas agreement and so on, so forth. Big picture. Where is J Street? J Street is an organization that not always, but that most of the time supports the foreign policy of the Obama administration. Now, you may not be happy with that. You may have your disagreements. In some cases, I have disagreements with them as well. But the point is, an organization that supports the foreign policy of the President of the United States, a president that 70% of the Jews voted for first time around and almost that same number second time around, a president who's not very popular now, but whose foreign policy is actually quite popular. You may not like that organization, but to see them as sort of beyond the pale or terribly radical as a result of supporting the administration, I think is a mistaken view.
But Eric, simple question to you. Give me, apart from this BDS, one example where they're not anti-Israeli. Put aside the Obama situation. I mean, most of the people in AIPAC are supporters of Obama as well, and I'm a great supporter of AIPAC. Just because they're for or against the president is not the issue here. It's a red herring, forgive me. What I'm asking you is one example where they've stood up for Israel, whether it was Hamas, whether it was on any single issue where they've stood up for Israel. Give me one issue apart from the BDS issue, which I think was a very clever way of showing we're still part of it. That's not enough to say that you're pro-Israel, when every other step that they've taken, every other single step, every other single public step they've taken has been anti-Israel. Even at the campuses, where you tell me they're doing such a wonderful job, they bring out these creeps who have been kind of condemned by even Haaretz, these people that are alleging that Israel are war criminals. I'm sorry, this is an example of anti-Zionist Jews of its worst order. They should not be part of a tent, and certainly not part of a tent which is there to speak on behalf of the Jewish people in relation to Israel. You have to draw a line, or is there no line?
Oh, no, absolutely there are lines.
Well,
absolutely there are lines. And I think we need to articulate what those lines are. Do they support Israel as a Jewish and democratic state? They do.
They say they do, but when it comes to when the chips are down, when there's an issue that arises every time internationally, they've been against Israel.
They've been
consistently.
Look, here again, we're talking about what can legitimately be seen as anti-Israel, or what is simply a part of the discussion where we have Jews on both sides. They've been very, very strong supporters of the Kerry Initiative and the efforts of the administration to promote the
I disagree
peace
with them,
talks.
but I agree that's legitimate, totally legitimate.
It's the single most important issue that's dominated the agenda over the course of the 9 months. You put that together with
But I'm not using that against them. I'm not holding that against
All right,
them.
but you're asking for an example. I'm giving you an example. They have
But
focused...
it's not positive.
Of course it's positive.
It's neutral as far as I'm concerned. It's irrelevant. I'm saying when an issue of Israel comes up, any issue of Israel comes up, they've been on the wrong side of the angels.
Well,
and what about the millions of dollars that have gone in PACs for anti-Israeli congressmen? I mean, where do you draw the line? They've been pushing for anti-Israeli congressmen to be elected.
Is that true?
Anti-Israeli congressmen.
Well,
they were against a resolution of the they went to the Congress and complained about a resolution against incitement. I mean, I can give you chapter and verse and keep going on and on and on. You remember with the flotilla, they described the Israelis there as having behaved cruelly. What sort of creeps are they? And how can you possibly describe these people as pro-Israel? I'm sorry, you're playing with words. And here in America, only in America, and I can say that as someone originally from Australia, only in America can you be anti, and just give yourself a tag pro and bravo, liberal, good, nice guys.
Supporting the Kerry talks, fighting on BDS, organizing pro-Israel students on campus, winning the support of people like Abe Foxman and the major umbrellas.
You're
of the
embarrassing
conservative
Abe. If he was here now and heard that, I can assure you he would distance himself. Afterwards.
Abe, to his credit, this isn't something that came after the fact. He came out publicly in support of them.
And afterwards, he said they brought it upon themselves because after listening to them, you could hear how they could destroy themselves.
He said, "I'm very unhappy with them on a whole number of subjects, but they need to be part of the conversation." Because for him, I believe, as for me, and as for all those people who supported them, there are red lines. They didn't cross them. And look, how different. Let me put it in these terms. Let me put it in these terms. Let's look in Israel. In fact, I believe these were Abe's words, and I don't want to talk in his name. He's very confident to talk himself and express his own views. Left side of the spectrum, Meretz, Labor Party.
Sure.
The left wing of the Labor Party. How different is the policy of J Street from the positions of the sort of the establishment left in Israel? For that matter, to use some of your own words, who do we have now in the President's Conference? We have APN, Americans for Peace Now, Shalom Akshav. We have Workmen's Circle. Yeah. We have Americans for Progressive Israel. We have a variety of left-wing groups. What is the difference between what they do and what J Street does? And the answer is mostly minimal. What's different about J Street, of course, is they have a large public profile. If you look at their positions, in most cases, we'd have to look at almost every one, there's not much of a difference. But what Foxman and others said is, you have a Meretz in Israel. You're probably not that happy with Meretz. That's my guess.
So? But they're a legitimate political party in Israel. You have a party in America which is going to the American government, going to a government in terms of Israel, a foreign government, and asking that government to pressure Israel, a democratically elected government of Israel. That's something that I must say to you, the other left-wing groups have not done in the past. They have not gone and actively campaigned in an organized manner to try to bring down a government and to pressure and to get the American government to pressure Israel to do things. Look, some of the things that we were forced to do in the last 6 or 12 months are pretty awesome. And for an external body of Jews who are sitting here in New York or in Los Angeles or wherever to take it upon themselves with particularly sensitive security issues which have life and death implications for us and to try to pressure the government to bring them. I say they're disgusting. They are disgusting.
But surely
and I'm glad they kept them out.
Surely you're not saying that is...
I didn't say they're illegitimate. They're illegitimate by their own. Keep them outside of the organized Zionist Jewish framework. Talk to them, dialogue with them, argue with them, yes, but don't bring them in the big tent.
Surely you're not saying that it's going to be inappropriate ever for an American Jewish group to support its government when it comes to Middle Eastern policy. You may disagree with the...
Eric, they're not supporting the government. They're trying to push Obama to go even harder than he is. I find Obama very difficult for us at the moment, extremely difficult, and the administration.
I understand.
Very, very difficult. But they are saying, Obama, you're letting us down. You're not pressuring Israel enough. They have said it. They've expressed it.
I think what they are mostly doing, they are a pro-Obama.
They are pro-Soros operation.
Oh, Soros,
That's where the money comes from.
No.
The bulk of the money comes from there.
Soros gave a donation, I believe,
at
the very beginning. And when that came out, that was an embarrassment. That was
because he lied.
Why was it an embarrassment?
Well, because Soros has problematic positions. That's A. And B, that they weren't completely upfront about it. And so
they lied.
They lied.
They lied. Yeah.
I mean, I don't remember the precise details. But
they denied Soros gave them money for a long time.
The fact that 7 or 8 years ago, Soros gave a donation is, when all is said and done, that's what we're talking about. So, to me, that's not a significant issue. I mean, look, you look on the right. You look on the right at the President's Conference. Yeah. ZOA just took on AIPAC and the government of Israel.
Yeah.
Openly.
Yeah.
Openly. Does that disqualify them from being on the President's Conference?
But they're not pressuring the American government to take them on. They can be critical. Look, Eric, the big difference is this. I can sit here with you and have major disagreements with you, but I have the enormous respect for you because at no stage in my mind do I question your love of Israel, your commitment to Israel, and the fact that you're a Zionist. Now, as far as the people running J Street, I was involved in the big way in the Soviet Jewry movement, and I was involved, I had to do a lot with communists. And I remember very clearly, you had the communists there at the front who were using the words like peace and progress for all sorts of purposes. There's a very similar pattern to this, and they had a lot of people that were well-meaning and misguided. And a lot of these people that follow J Street, they think they hear the word liberal, they think it's great, we're liberals. There's a big, big difference. And that's, the big difference is, between you and them is that the people at the top there, in my opinion, are not Zionists, they're not friends of the Jewish people. Well, and maybe of the Jewish people as they see it, but they're certainly not friends of Israel. You are. Whatever differences we have, I respect that. And that's why I can sit here comfortably with you and argue with you, passionately argue with you, but I have never questioned your integrity.
And you don't think that Abe Foxman shares those concerns that you have? You think that someone like Abe, who's been around so long, knows the community?
Abe, after the conference, after the meeting was over, Abe said they brought this upon themselves when we interviewed them and we heard what they had to say. They lost the votes.
He said they handled the interview badly. He did not change his position that they should be a part of the.
Well, I'm sorry. I'll be seeing Abe.
But we should have Abe at the table.
You should. We should. We shouldn't be talking about Abe.
Yeah, we should.
Well, the fact is, he went public.
You brought it up.
But I'm happy I did because your point was my point.
Yeah.
People who are against bringing J Street in have to really understand and explain why is it that so many people who are in the mainstream, in the Jewish world, you're in the mainstream, Eric.
No question I'm in the mainstream.
And so is Abe Foxman, and so is Steve Gutto, and so is Rick Jacobs.
The JCPA, the conservative movement, the reform movement.
Right, so is Julie Schoenfeld.
The ADL and so on. They all, just so that you should know, you're entitled to your view, they all have a different take.
Well, I don't think you can talk organisation. You can talk about people.
You can talk about
people. And I'm sure that in the reform movement there'll be a lot of people that agree with me, and in the conservative movement.
Absolutely.
Of course. I mean,
okay, I want to tell both of you what I hear, and then have you respond.
Yeah.
I hear two things. For those who really think that the conference made a serious error, their argument is that, number one, J Street tends to speak for younger Jews, and that you don't want to shut them out. And you know, I mentioned to you that I got this comment from Linda on the West Coast, and her response was, talk about a cloistered mindset and putting yourself in a very out of touch with the real world box. That's what she sees the President's Conference having done. And there are people who argue that, number one, you want the people whom J Street reaches to also feel that they're being part of the overall Jewish discussion, and that they're not being shunned or pushed aside or put in a little box outside the Jewish community. And therefore, even people like an Abe Foxman, who is against much of what J Street has done and stands for, believes there's a greater advantage to having them inside the tent than outside the tent. So I hear that. Number two, the argument is that J Street is not simply once funded by Soros, but is basically a creation of Soros, who had a very specific goal in mind. And the goal of Soros is there never should have been a state of Israel, and that J Street is an extension of that larger philosophy. I told you what I heard from one side, I'm telling you what I hear from the other side. What you have here is really what J Street has done has been able to attract people who are on the margin of the Jewish community. In some instances, they're not pro-Israel at all, and has given them a way to effect a change in U.S. policy, all of which is in some way opposed to the well-being of the state of Israel. So I didn't hear you answer on Goldstone. I didn't hear you answer, is it
they
true?
They were wrong on Goldstone.
Is it? Yes, but it's not whether we're wrong. It was surprising they took the position at all. What does it mean to you if they are in fact funding members of Congress who are anti-Israel? What does that say to you?
First of all, we'd have to look at each particular
Yes,
race.
we would,
What's different about J Street is they're both a nonprofit organization engaged in Israel advocacy.
What's both?
And
What's the both?
a PAC.
They are. Yes, they have two separate arms.
Those are separate arms that they're
Yes,
legally
but
separate.
they're all
and so on
J
and so
Street.
forth.
That
They're all
is J Street.
So it's legitimate to look at the candidates one by one, see their records, and make a judgment here. But what I'm suggesting is there's a big picture part of this that I really think you're missing, and I think, look, the reality is they're a pro-Obama organization. They've been a pro-Obama organization from the beginning. They support the administration in a Jewish community which is sympathetic to this president and which voted for him. Now,
Is this different than AIPAC?
yes.
You don't think the AIPAC is supportive of President Obama?
The AIPAC tries to make a point of having a broader political view and having close ties to both Republicans and Democrats. I think without question, I'm acknowledging that J Street has much stronger ties to a Democratic administration than to any Republican group or any potential
No one would be
Republican
upset
group.
with that. No one would be
Yeah,
upset
I'm not
with that.
upset with that.
Well, what I'm saying is, in other words, to look at the big picture and say they're anti-Israel and undermining Israel.
But not because of that.
Is, I believe, a misread. And the notion that somehow the Jews have been misled, let's have Mark give us a little bit of credit here, that somehow the Jews have been misled. We don't really know what they're about. We don't really know where their money is coming from. They have this other agenda that's not apparent. They're a left-leaning group, too far to the left for some American Jews, occasionally too far to the left for me. But the issue that Abe Foxman and Julie Schoenfeld and other Jewish leaders were speaking to was, should they be part of the conversation? Should they be
In a formal way, that's correct.
Should they be around the table? And there, the responsible centrist elements of the community, by and large, came out, yes. Now, you disagree, you disagree.
No, I'm sorry. You can't take away one fact. Yeah. They have a consistent policy, and I'll rub that in, putting aside the finances, a consistent policy, with the exception of the BDS perhaps, a consistent policy of being anti-Israel on campus, anti-Israeli in Congress, anti-Israeli in the media, anti-Israeli full stop. That to me, you play with games, and just because they say we are pro-Israel, and just because they like Obama, doesn't mean that disqualifies everything.
They take on Jewish voices of peace, the real anti-Israel forces. They've organized Jewish students in a way that nobody else, for all their big talk, nobody else has been able to do.
But why doesn't that sway you?
Because they're birds of a feather. And I know the difference between them and these others. It's a question of degree.
Okay, so nothing Eric has said so far has swayed you?
On the contrary, what Eric has said has confirmed to me that there's a problem here with my Jewish liberal friends, that they are kind of mesmerized by the word pro-Israel, pro-peace.
Well, that's not what Eric is saying.
If they're consistent in their anti-Israeli activity on every issue, that doesn't stir you.
But you and I have a different view of what is anti-Israel activity. I think they've played an honorable and important role in supporting the Charity Initiative, which is supporting Israel's interest, in my view. An important and critical role in creating a Jewish presence on campus. This is admirable kinds of things that I'm surprised you're not a little bit more sympathetic to, but okay.
Amazing, right?
I see their impact on campus is highly negative. They're bringing in these people that describe Israel as war criminals. How can you describe that as being positive? That's opening up.
I don't know the details here, so it's hard for me to speak. I have a cousin. I mean, we shouldn't use personal examples. Who's now attending Williams College, went to a day school, a good conservative kid, Jewishly engaged. He went to campus, and J Street was what he got involved in. This kid is as pro-Israel as you or I. He spent 6 months there as a senior. He finds it to be an engaging and open place where people express their views, where you support Israel from a left-wing perspective for sure, and he's utterly enthralled by what he does. Does that impress me? You bet. You bet that impresses me.
Okay, I want to address another of the columns you wrote. You wrote a very critical piece of Ari Shavit's book, My Promised Land. And My Promised Land is probably, the book of the year right
Yes,
now
yes.
on the Jewish scene, and Ari Shavit has become a
Yeah.
star,
Yeah.
is asked to speak all over the place. And I want to say this, because I wanted you to discuss things that bother you, and I have an issue with you, because while I thought the article you wrote expressed a lot of what I feel, I didn't feel it went far enough. And I've talked to,
Wow.
and I'm going to tell you why. And my wife Ruth, and Ruth is with me all the time, and Ruth and I know Izzy very, very well. And she said to me, she's also surprised at what you didn't say. And then I want to know whether Eric agrees with anything
You're
you
getting
said.
soft, Izzy. I mean,
And again, I want to also say, because because of my feelings about My Promised Land, which are going to become clear, I have been with Ari Shavit now a number of times, and he's a lovely guy, lovely guy. He loves Israel. He is passionate about Israel. And what I really feel is, and I'm really hoping that one day he'll sit at this table. He hasn't had the time to do so far. I interviewed him when he was a speaker at APAC, but I didn't talk to him about the book. And I want to talk to him because I feel in some way he is a tortured soul.
Yes.
Who means well. The question is, what is the message of the book? And I want to describe why it upsets me, and then I want to hear what each of you have to say about the book. And there was a theme in the book, and it's the theme that I wanted you to write about. You wrote about the chapter on Lida, and what Ari Shavit has in the book is a scathing criticism of an Israeli event during the War of Independence of 1948, where the Arab community of Lida, which is now Lod, which is near the Ben Gurion airport, and is in the center in some way of this new emerging Jewish state. Ari Shavit says, in essence, there couldn't have been an Israel if there was a Lida, and that therefore Israel had, he implies, this is an implication, a stated goal of destroying the Arab community of Lida. Now, when I use the word destroy, they did not go in there and kill everybody. There was a battle. During the battle, there were Israelis who died and there were Arabs who died. The way Shavit describes it, the Israelis took advantage of and in some way massacred Arabs and then forced the Arab population to leave. And he talks at the end of the chapter of how that basically Jews who were forced to endure similar type of situations and were very often forced to leave, and the image of Anna Tefka and Fiddler on the Roof, and all the Jews have to walk out. Here he says a column leaves, this column, very famous column that is photographed of all of these Arab families having to leave their home in Lida. His last line is, and the column is still marching to this day. And you pick up on why did, of all the things, somebody who was as pro-Israel as Shavit seems to be, claims to be, and is, why does he make an issue of a chapter which you also argue is out of context and is historically inaccurate?
Yes, that's important.
And it is important, and we've done a lot of investigation on other sources. It's not like Lida was not discussed.
Exactly.
It's not like, oh my goodness, thank you, Ari Shavit, for even telling us about the Battle of Lida. But my concern with the book, and then I want both of you to discuss it, is the overall context of it. And again, I'm assuming many of our viewers have not read it, so I just want to set it in context, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. Basically, Shavit begins his book by describing how his great-grandfather, Herbert Benchwich, is sent by Theodore Herzl himself, almost as a 19th century Joshua, to scout out the land and to see whether, in fact, this Palestine is a place that Jews can go to. It's not clear that Herzl had as much understanding of what going back to Eretz Yisrael meant, but Herzl saw Palestine as a place that the Jews had a historic tie to, and that it should be a place to save Jews from the persecution they were facing in both Eastern and Western Europe. And so Benchwich is on this journey. He's an aristocratic man from London. He leads a group, and then he has a diary. And Shavit writes what he imagines is happening to Benchwich, his great-grandfather, based on the diaries. And this is what he writes. This is how he describes it. There are more than 500,000 Arabs, Bedouins, and Druze in Palestine in 1897. There are 20 cities and towns and hundreds of villages. So how can the pedantic Bentwich not notice them? That there is another people now occupying the land of his ancestors. And then Ari Shavit answers the question by saying, my great-grandfather does not see because he is motivated by the need not to see. He does not see because if he does, he will have to turn back. He will have to turn back. And then he talks about the fact that the Zionists are about to replace one people with another. There is no place for the Palestinian peasants who stand by their olive and fig trees and wave hello to the British gentleman. And then Shavit basically embraces what I consider to be the Palestinian narrative, as he describes what Theodor Herzl and the Zionists, as Shavit refers to them all the time, Zionists, what the Herzl Zionists seek to do. They want the Arab land to be confiscated by Europe so that a European problem will be solved outside the boundaries of Europe. Again, I begin with you, Izzy. For me, the underlying refrain of Shavit's book, and there are many wonderful things he writes about the extraordinary accomplishments of the State of Israel, both pre-establishment of the state and then at various stages during the state. All of that is fabulous. And he's a great writer, and it's an easy read. But there is a basin into which everything he writes is in. And it's the refrain, we took their land. Their land. And by the way, Shavit says clearly, it was to my benefit, the benefit of my great-grandfather, the benefit of me, and to the benefit of my children. I love the State of Israel. I want the State of Israel. But the problem is, for Shavit, is that we did this on the backs of someone else, taking their land. And I expected you to go after him on that premise, because in America, part of the reason why Shavit has become so celebrated is that there are some Jews, let alone some Americans, maybe there's some Jews, who are still very uncomfortable with Israel, because in their mind, Shavit is telling the truth, that we stole someone's land to create a land of our own. And if that's true, it calls the entire integrity, legitimacy of Israel into question. And there are many people who only talk about that aspect of Shavit's book, and to them, that's the message of the book, and they celebrate the book because finally there's an Israeli willing to put this in writing. So I want to know your reaction to it, and then I want you really both to speak to Shavit's claim that Bentwich, if he had seen the responsible, moral, ethical, Jewish thing to do, would have been to turn back.
First of all, what you've said is really still an extension of my article, because my article is essentially saying that he created a chapter, and you've extended it beyond that, that he created a chapter which effectively, if you were to take it as read and as correct, meant that we were born in sin. And that is the source of the whole problem, and that, as you rightly say, is effectively paving the way for the Palestinian narrative. Now, Shavit is a remarkable journalist. He is not an ideologue in the sense of consistency, and if you look at his writings over the years, even sometimes from week to week in the Haaretz, they change and they flip and they flop. And he came out of an extraordinary attack on the publisher of Haaretz, Amos Shokin, for post-Zionism and all sorts of things, and took a lot of guts, the publisher. So he's a what I would call a bit confused on these issues. I also feel that there was underlying, and here I may be doing him an injustice, but I think there was an underlying desire to become popular on the American liberal front, and that this was calculated. Certainly the chapter on Lod was written in such a way, the New Yorker grabbed it and gave him publicity, the New York Times gave it reports, and I said, your book will be forgotten except for that chapter and that thing. So to that extent, we're pretty much in the same pattern. You've extended it further, rightly so.
Now, what about the claim itself?
In terms of the claim, this goes back to the heart of whether we have a right to come back to our homeland and whether we displaced people. If we look at the history of the Zionist movement throughout the ages, you can refer to certain areas where there may have been injustices caused. But by and large, we wanted to have a country where we could have lived and coexisted with the Arabs in our midst had they not turned against us. That, I think, is a central issue that we have to push through, that we did not displace the Arabs, that we created, that in fact, the Zionist settlement in this country created a refuge which brought more Arabs into this country from Syria and from other places. And I think this is just shoddy. I mean, it would take me quite a while to sit down and give a historical background, but I think we have a very, very strong black and white case to prove that whereas in every historical issue of this nature there are grey areas, overwhelmingly we were on the side of the angels and we have nothing to look back. We were entitled to come back to this country. We could and would have lived peacefully side by side with the Palestinians had they been willing to accept us and they had not been exploited by their feudal overlords.
Was it their land?
No. It was nobody's land. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And there was not an independent Palestinian any more than there was an independent Palestinian entity at that stage. They were just part of southern Syria.
So how do you hear all this?
There's a certain, excuse me, apologetic tone that distresses me.
Apologetic tone by whom?
By my colleagues around the table. I just have a different take on the book. I thought it was a very good book.
Yeah.
I thought it was a pretty tough book. This notion that he's some wild-eyed liberal is, I think, simply not true.
I didn't say that.
No, but all right, fine. Maybe Mark said it.
I didn't say it. I said it's a well-written book. There's a lot that's wonderful. I think there's an underlying theme.
I think we make a mistake.
You must speak to the underlying theme.
I think we make a mistake when we get caught up in too many details about the Palestinian narrative. It's a battle we're never going to win. And that in the final analysis is, in my opinion, not terribly relevant. Is there some sin on the Zionist side? Of course there is, and our own historians say so. But the point is, there's more sin on the other side. And the emphasis that we need to give here is you had two people competing over a land, and for 60, 70, 100 years, it's been clear that the only way to deal with that is to divide the land. That is justice. And the reason that that didn't happen is not because of our sins, which existed, but primarily because of the sins of the other side.
Okay, I'm not talking about sin here. I'm asking you to address a fundamental premise of this book, that we took their land.
Yes.
Does that bother you? Do you see it the same way Shavit sees it?
I think you're confusing things. Was there a massacre in Lydda?
That's not the question. The question is, did we take their land? There's one refrain in this book. I can show it to you chapter after chapter. And by the way, it didn't bother you, the refrain.
Look, he said...
It didn't bother you, right?
Because I think you're misreading it. What he said...
I'm misreading. If my grandfather had seen, he would have had to go back.
What he said in that book, and if I had the book, I could look at the precise quote, is we needed to have a state.
That's right.
That's
right.
He says,
I needed it, and my daughter needs it.
We didn't have a state. This is what he didn't give. This is
the
what he
only
didn't give
question is,
sufficient effort. He didn't give sufficient.
Does he claim as much as we needed the state? And he loves this state, by the way.
Yes.
It is there's so much positive about this book, but I'm saying that it is couched in one overarching theme, that we took their land.
But what I'm saying is that's one element in a larger picture.
Yeah, but he's asking a very difficult question for you to answer, I can see.
Did we take their land? In certain instances, I suppose that we did. They took our land and didn't respond to our overtures to resolve this in a peaceful way. So what you're trying to make me do is to say
I'm not trying to make
that
you do it.
you're trying. That's how you're trying to steer the conversation, my dear friend. You're trying to make me say, well, we didn't take their land.
But maybe you think that we did.
For example, in Lydda, I mean, Elliot Abrams had a very good review. I don't know if you saw it. It was in the Jewish Review of Books. And he said, if you look at Lydda,
Yes.
what do you see? He said, if you look at the research, we killed Arabs. He said,
Yes.
Maybe we killed a few dozen. Maybe
Yes.
we killed as many as several hundred.
Yes.
So it seems reasonably clear. And then Benny Morris wrote about this.
But
It
I
seems
understand
reasonably-
the context.
It seems
of what he's
reasonably
It was a
here.
war. It was a
Yeah,
war.
Exactly.
People were getting killed
There was a
all the
war.
time.
They were not killed. They were not massacred.
By the way,
Nobody suggests they were massacred.
And the Etzion block, the Arabs massacred.
Abrams-
People
What
died.
Abrams acknowledges is the possibility that maybe some of them were in fact killed.
That could have happened.
no one
It happens in
disagrees.
war.
But
Yeah.
so you're asking me, does that or does that not mean that we took their land? And what I'm saying is it's a question without an answer, but in the final analysis it's not important.
No. It is, by the way, it is a critical problem, a question that needs to be answered. It's at the basis of the BDS movement. It's at the basis of the attempt to
You cannot win
delegitimize
that
Israel.
argument.
What?
When I go to a campus and when I'm challenged on the refugees and we stole your land, and what I say is, you had two peoples with valid claims to this land. The reason that they couldn't divide the land was because of Arab or Palestinian resistance. That was the reason in the 1940s. That was the reason in the 1930s. That's the reason today. Doesn't mean that we're blameless, but that's the reality. Dividing the land between those two peoples was the answer then, and it's the answer now.
No, but you're
Nobody's
not
arguing about
addressing the issue here. By the way, this is what he writes about Lydda. If Zionism was to be, Lydda could not be. If Lydda was to be, Zionism could
This
not
is
be.
terrible. That's terrible.
By the way, that's not true.
Yeah, it's not.
If Lydda wanted to live in peace with the Israeli state, Lydda could have been.
Of course.
This whole premise that Shavit establishes is based on...
What happened in the war? Three things happened in the war. Why do you have refugees? You have refugees because the Arab leaders told their people to leave in some cases.
Maybe.
You have refugees because in a war you have refugees.
Yes.
Right.
And you have refugees
were
because
pushed.
it seems that in some cases they were pushed out,
Right.
Yes, yes.
either by killing,
Right.
Yes.
or
whatever.
by
Very
or by,
little,
or
very
by force.
little killing. Very little killing.
And there you see, and that's
Marginal.
part of all
Very-
of that and so on. So the point is, were there limited instances where, in fact, we took their land?
Yes.
And the answer
Yes.
is yes.
The question is,
And for him to point that
was
out
it?
is
No.
legitimate.
But he's saying something broader,
He made it
which
central.
you're not addressing. He's not saying there was a village we took. If it was a village, there'd be no.
exactly.
He's saying
I don't think if
that
you-
Bentwich had to go back because the land already was theirs. The land was not
If
theirs.
you read the whole book, I don't believe that's the message.
Oh, Eric.
I just don't believe
I'll
that's
give
the
I'll
message.
give you passage after passage.
He
This
talks.
is the book.
He talks about Israel as a miracle, and
Yes.
Israel fundamentally as an act of justice. Fundamentally as an act of
There are
justice.
contradictions. He contradicts himself.
Of course he
Okay.
contradicts.
Do I wash,
Fundamentally,
do
that's
I
how he
wash
sees it.
my hands because of Lydda? When I try to be honest about it, I see that the choice is stark. Either reject Zionism because of Lydda, or accept Zionism along with Lydda. That is not the proper way to formulate the
that's
question.
But what I'm suggesting, elsewhere in the book, he makes precisely the opposite point.
Okay, no, but we're saying that.
Israel as a miracle, Israel as an act of justice, Israel as a necessary project for the survival of the Jewish people.
Yes,
Israel
he
that
argues
fought,
all that.
that fights
Eric,
against
Eric, the
Palestine.
pieces that
we
the pieces
did it in sin.
and the pieces that will be remembered from him will not be the positive ones. There'll be those pieces that will be quoted forever. Eric, there's one thing you said before that I want to take issue with you.
Yeah.
You said we don't want to go too deep into this issue of the Palestinian narrative and our narratives. I'm saying to you that our narrative is it's the central issue for Jewish life and for Jewish continuity in Zionism today. Because if we do not bring up a Jewish generation of youngsters that understand our narrative and they begin absorbing the Arab narrative, then we're doomed. We have to make sure that our narrative gets out, at least amongst our own.
I think it's
This
also
is
true.
crucial, absolutely
and part
crucial.
of our
It's
problem
central.
is we're getting into other issues. Part of our problem is we misstate our narrative. And that,
How?
look, if additional settlement on not within Israel or within what will ultimately be Israel after peace is a central element of the policy of any Israeli government, right or left, making the case for Israel's narrative becomes 20 times harder than it would otherwise be. And, you know, it's fine to talk about what happened 80 years ago and 50 years ago and so on. I've spent time on campus trying to explain the settlement policy of Israel to college students. Those who were sympathetic and those who were not. You know how hard that is?
Yeah, very hard.
You know how
Especially in
hard
America.
that is?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
It's impossible. So
let's
we
address
need
it for a moment.
to have a narrative that we can sell that doesn't focus on those things that I think are contrary to the central values of the narrative.
okay.
These are some of the issues
Well,
that
spend a moment with me here.
Yeah.
Summarize for me, in essence, the real what? Not challenge, the real problem, the real obstacle that you see settlements posing at this point in history.
The central part that people understand in America, and that resonates, because there's a basic sympathy for Israel, despite all of our problems, is that we want to live in peace, and that means living alongside the Palestinians, each with our own state, dividing the land. When what we hear day after day, and not only from Israel's enemies, but from the government ministers, about one new settlement announcement after another new settlement announcement, it's exceedingly difficult to get people back to those central points. It's exceedingly difficult. And the difference between in the blocks and outside of the blocks and so on and so forth, I mean, both in political terms and in substantive terms, you end up losing your way and you lose a battle that otherwise, I believe, can easily win because I believe that we're right. And, you know, it takes us back. What's happened after the last 9 months? I mean,
don't say that it was the settlements that brought this down.
I know, I'm not saying it was the settlements that brought this down. But what I'm saying is that the PR dimensions of, you know, constant announcements by various people in the government led to a terrible distortion of what was going on, and once again made it so much harder to sell a policy that we ought to be able to sell without, or, you know, overly much difficulty. And
the biggest blow up was an announcement of settlement in Gilo, which is a Jerusalem suburb, and that was that was a central issue which everybody became excited about.
And that was ridiculous.
Tens of thousands of people being slaughtered in Syria. A few buildings in Gilo, and subject across the road from me.
In the last 9 months, Israel announced planning, plans to undertake planning to build 8,000 units, almost all of which are beyond the blocks. Now, if I were defending, I would say, all they're doing is planning. It hasn't actually happened. Maybe it won't happen. There's a political side to it. That's the reality. Why, in the course of the last 9 months, as we're immersed in these negotiations, would the government of Israel announce its intention to do planning for 8,000 units, almost all of which will not be part of the state of Israel if there's a two-state solution? Why would they do that? How
Why
does
would
it
they do
serve
that?
their
They
interests?
They did that because of an internal political government understandings, and also because they made it very clear, both to Kerry and to the Palestinians, who understood clearly that by releasing the prisoners, which I think was an abomination and a terrible thing they did, and they should never have agreed to the pressure from the Americans to release those prisoners. I still say it's something which will curse us forever and ever. They made the wrong move there, but they made a deal there that they would go ahead with their settlement policies as before, for internal reasons. Now, I'm not happy about that.
It was a mistake? In your,
I think
your
it was a
position?
mistake to release the prisoners. If they were going to do anything,
Was it a
they could.
mistake to indicate they were going to continue to build?
No, not if the
Well,
other party agreed.
Eric-
The other party agreed, and
I'm sorry,
Bibi Netanyahu,
Who agreed?
The Palestinians and the Americans understood clearly that the settlement policy would be continued if they released these 100 murderers.
Look, first of all, I happen to agree. I think releasing the murderers was outrageous.
We agree.
Absolutely
We agree.
unacceptable.
Yeah.
The initial choice was, do we have
Either
some
or.
kind of a settlement freeze or do we release
Yes,
the murderers?
correct.
And then,
I would rather the other.
because they wouldn't stand up to the settlers, they chose to release the murderers. I think it was LChayim actually that ran a poll, like 3 days after, saying, given the choice, did the government make the right choice? The numbers were something like 79% to 11%. Overwhelming popular opposition
Yeah, I agree.
to this.
Yeah.
All right, so let's say that therefore everybody understood that there was going to be some settlement. You use a little seichel. You use a little
All
common
right,
sense.
but it's irrelevant. Look, I think you're blowing it out of proportion. I agree with you and the principle, but you're blowing it out of proportion. The issue we had with the Palestinians, first of all, Kerry was like an unguided missile. He didn't know what he was doing. And I'm afraid to say, and I say this as a foreigner, I'm not an American, but the American Secretary of State must be one of the worst Secretaries of State that this country's ever had. I've never seen anybody that's bumbled so consistently in everything. And secondly, Abbas from day one, all he wanted was to screw more pieces of concessions out of us without giving anything back in return. Nothing in return.
Look, Abbas and the Palestinians have never delivered on peace. They didn't deliver this time either.
Never will.
And maybe not. So then the question, therefore, that Israel faces is Azma. So what do we do about
Interim arrangements, which Kerry messed up. Kerry should have moved for an interim
it?
arrangement.
All right, well, look, we disagree on Kerry, but let's put that aside.
Do you think, the process went well?
Obviously didn't go well. It didn't produce a result.
Then I ask you a different way. What was, from your perspective, the reason why this peace initiative failed?
Well, the Palestinians have never been able to deliver. They didn't deliver here. B, I think Israel made a number of mistakes along the way, some that I've already referred to, which did not help. I mean, I don't believe in equivalence. It's not like, everybody is responsible to the same degree. It was primarily Palestinian resistance. Israel needs to help the process, recognize their own political situation, their own vulnerability. The fact that you may have said we're going to settle doesn't mean that, therefore, you announce from the rooftops that you're going to settle. And more fundamentally, what happens as we move forward? I mean, I look to people like Michael Oren, Dan Meridor, who are Gilead Sher, people who are saying we need to have some kind of interim arrangements.
Yes.
And while they're all different, they all say nothing is going to work unless Israel stops to settle beyond the blocks.
That is what the American administration, if it were to concentrate on an interim settlement and try to reach some arrangement, the Prime Minister of Israel had given hints that he was willing to negotiate on the external blocks. He made it very clear, but there
And
was
yet,
no
when
response.
push comes to shove, when he had to choose between a settlement freeze and releasing murderers, he chose to release murderers because he
That's it.
wasn't prepared to stand up to the settlers.
He
So
could,
I mean,
he could have then. I can tell you, the country and the government, if he had a credible peace partner, would move forward with these things overnight, and nobody could stand in the way except the extreme right. They would go out of
So
government.
now what? Let's say you and
Do
I
you
just-
agree with that?
I believe it's true, and I think Israel needs to help the process along.
How much more?
No. Stop settling.
Don't make the settlements the be-all and the... It's an escape valve. You can say, rightly so, it's a PR operation, but don't really imagine that it's the central factor.
Look,
the central factor is that the Arabs are... There's no great difference
in the
between
mid-19
the objectives of PA, Abbas, and Hamas.
You and I
They're
agree.
all
You and I
want to
agree
see
on
us
that.
go.
You and I agree on that.
Good.
I mean, you don't have to argue with me. What I'm saying is, in the mid-1990s, the number of settlers outside of the blocks, I mean, we haven't precisely defined
the
blocks.
blocks.
Outside of the blocks was 33,000. Today, depending on who you ask, it's around 100,000. Some say maybe it's 120,000, and so on. Those numbers continue to grow. If you're going to divide the land, you can't continue to build settlements in the part of the land that's going to be part of somebody else's country. And you can't dismiss it as irrelevant when year after year those numbers increase, and they've increased by 3 or 4 times in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, but the amount of land which is involved is about 2 or 3%.
That's not important.
2 or 3%.
That's not important. I mean, people always say that, but it's an excuse. Because how hard is it going to be for Israel to
going to
move
be very hard. I agree.
90,
Very hard.
100, 120,000 people off of that land?
Very hard. Very
It's going
hard.
to be incredibly difficult. Think
Yes, it will
of
be.
the trauma. I want to avoid that trauma.
Okay.
So you don't make things worse.
Okay.
And, Oren.
When you say okay, does that mean you agree with Eric?
I agree that the answer is to look to a situation where we're going to separate.
No.
And by
Eric is saying stop it. Is Izzy Lieberman willing to say on Shalom TV the Israeli government must stop all settlement growth outside the blocks?
We cannot stop this
I'm asking you a question.
unilaterally. No,
you're not willing to say
not
that.
unilaterally.
So that means...
What I'm saying is, yes, it's something that is up for negotiation. But we're just negotiating, giving and giving.
No, but
and
we're
giving.
not... I'm not
You're
even...
negotiating, but I say this
I'm
is
not even in favor of negotiating.
Yeah,
Because
okay.
I don't believe that the Palestinians can deliver. So I believe that the Israelis have to say, look, the Americans are out of it now. The Palestinians are unable to be
Good point.
forthcoming. That being so, what is it that we are going to do to preserve our own interests? And by the way, I'm not in favor of removing a single soldier. You leave military installations where they are. You don't take any security risks.
You're a real hawk.
I am a hawk.
I know. I'm saying, kol hakavod.
I am a hawk. The fact is, civilian settlement outside the blocks cannot continue because in another 10 years, it's not going to be 100 or 110,000 or 120. It's going to be 150. And then we're going to have a single-state solution, and that's not what Zionism is about.
Yeah, and we agree we don't want a single state. I don't want a single state.
Then why won't you say, Izzy Lieberman says to the state of Israel, stop it?
Because there's a dynamic with the people that we're dealing with. And if we just stop it now, it will be seen, it will simply embolden the extremists to say we're taking them down step by step. We give nothing away.
Extremists
They're
on the
going
Arab
backwards.
side.
Yes.
What do you
That's
say
the
to
only
that?
reason why. And it's a serious reason not to be dismissed.
Israel is stronger now than she's ever been. Stronger now, militarily, even with all the problems with the administration, security cooperation is at its height. The Arab world is exceedingly weak. I think Israel needs to look out after its own interests and preserve the Zionist character of the state.
We agree.
Does that mean you're willing to say no more settlements outside the block? So don't say you agree.
I agree with his general thesis.
Yes,
that
but
we
his
have to-
thesis has a therefore that you're not willing to accept.
not tactically at this stage.
Here I'm going to push you and
Ah,
think,
by all means.
I believe it's an excuse. This notion that somehow this will weaken us in terms of our enemies and so on. If every soldier stays in place, every military installation stays in place, if we respond to terror the way that only we can and the way that we must, and no more releasing any prisoners, thank you very much.
Agree on
The
that.
notion that if we start to pull back from civilian settlements beyond the blocks, that's going to be something that will greatly weaken Israel. I said, I don't believe it. I believe, look, Netanyahu is a smart man. In his head, in his heart, he knows how this needs to go, but he doesn't have the strength. He does not have the strength to stand up to the settlers.
What about within his own party? Does he have strength
Look,
in there?
the current government does not support a two-state solution, as Bennett keeps saying over and over
Is
again.
that true? Is that true?
When the chips are down, it will.
I
And
hope-
does.
I hope you're right.
I know I'm right on this because the electorate will not stand in the way if we had an opportunity.
But if you and I are both right about the Arabs, 30 years from now, that still isn't...
That may be the case.
That may be the case, and then there will be so many settlers that Israel will be faced with a number of options, not a single one of which will be acceptable.
My great concern is that there is no solution in the short term other than interim solutions, and that has to take step by step. It cannot come that we're just going to give up anything under pressure. It's got to be done of our own volition. Now's not the time.
Okay, by the way, your pushing, Izzy, was very important. And I'm going to suggest, and then you'll tell me if I'm being unfair to you.
No, never unfair.
Okay. My instinct is that you have said to me, and I believe you, that if there were a real peace partner, and that you believed, not in a fake peace, but that it was a real peace,
yes.
And that this Jewish vision that really started in the 1930s, that we would share the land with the Arab population, that there would be a Palestinian state right alongside a Jewish state, and we live in peace.
Halavai, yes.
You would be prepared, despite the fact where you stand politically, where you stand Jewishly,
yes.
You're ready to, as much as you'd like all of Eretz Yisrael to be Israel, you would be prepared to make the two-state solution.
Absolutely.
Okay, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No question. You're not pushing me there.
No, that's not the push. Now here's the push. I think that you are convinced that there needs to be a sea change in the Palestinian community before the kind of reality that you're prepared to live with tomorrow would be possible. And that therefore for you, the strategy that you would hope the State of Israel continues to adopt is one of hanging on while we do not have a two-state solution. And that as a result for you, you don't want to see Israel give up continuing to establish a presence on the West Bank, not because you're not ready to give it up if there were a peace, but you don't see a peace coming. And in that case, the question becomes for Izzy Lieberman, well, what does Israel do day to day in real life? And in real life, Israel, from your perspective, should continue for a number of reasons. Slow but steady growth of a Jewish presence, an Israeli Jewish presence on the West Bank. And if one day there is a peace, you'll worry about it then. But in the meantime, you feel it strengthens in some way the overall presence of Israel. And what I believe Eric is going to ask you is, then how do you ultimately deal without creating an apartheid state, without creating some impossible situation of a human relations problem? How are you going to deal with the fact that you have somewhere between 1 and 3 million Arabs living on the West Bank as well, who must be at some point dealt with? And the Jewish notion of, well, we'll just delay it, we'll delay it, doesn't ultimately confront that ultimate challenge. First of all, have I articulated your position pretty correctly?
To an extent, I would say that if you look at the situation, the last 20 years, for 20 years, people have been saying, if we don't move quickly and do something radically and drastically, we're going to be 20 years from now down the tube. Now it's 20
chance.
Now it's 20 years later, and we're much better than we were 20 years ago, and I reckon we'll be much better 20 years from now.
But have I articulated your vision at the moment?
To some extent, yes.
Where was I wrong?
Not quite in the same black and white terms that you've described of just, leaving it alone. There are things that can be done on an interim basis during that period. We have to understand one thing.
And you'd welcome
There's
them.
one thing that, yes, of course I welcome.
Yes.
The real problem we have, and here I'm going to say something pretty drastic. We have in the PA and Hamas area a community which, after Arafat and Abbas's education, the radical youngsters there are not greatly different than the youngsters that were brought up under the Nazis. The Palestinians never liked Jews. There was always conflicts between the Arabs and Jews. But the radical hatred and anti-Semitism which has been inculcated and continues to be inculcated to them, I wrote a piece and I gave a description how you are brought up in a society where hatred is sanctified, where you are told you'll go to heaven if you take a few Jews out, and if you're lucky, you'll be captured, you'll get a university degree, and then you'll be released. That is the goal of the idealistic Arab. I mean, being a bit primitive and crude. But the reality is we're dealing with a society which is based on death and hatred. And until that changes, it's so difficult on the grass. If the grassroots has been poisoned to such an extent, it's now self-fulfilling. Even if Abbas wanted to, and I don't think he does, but even if he wanted to, he'd have great difficulty. The people beneath him, it's a terrible tragedy. On the other hand, you look at Germany today. Look, the Nazi Germany was a terrible country. Look at Germany 10 years later after democratization and changes. Give them an educated...
They were brought to their knees first.
That's the problem. That's the problem, yeah.
So we understand where Izzy's coming from. And what do you say?
What I say is my Zionism is really very simple. Israel needs to be a Jewish state,
Yes.
with a secure Jewish majority, and a democratic state.
Yep.
The tragedy of right-wing Zionism is that it seems to have drifted away from its democratic roots, not its Jewish roots.
By that you mean?
It is the problem of democracy tends to be pushed away in favor of other problems.
But how is it not I've heard this, I just don't understand what it means. I don't see anything going on internally within Israel, even in terms of what Israel wants on the West Bank, that suggests to me there's any less of a commitment to a democratic process, a democratic context, a democratic society.
Well, look, fundamentally what I'm saying is you can't have an eternal occupation. All right, so we have the reality of Palestinian rejectionism. So therefore, what do you have to do? You have to do something along the lines of what Amos Yadlin, for example, is proposing. He said, you can't create a political agreement that's going to give us two states, but you could nonetheless create more or less a reality of two states.
That's what I was, yeah.
A reality of two states.
Step by step.
And, he lays out how you do that. But he says, as does everybody else who talks about this, you can't do that unless you stop settlement. And then there are a variety of arrangements that involve, military forces in place, encouraging settlers beyond the border to come back, and, maintaining your position while you negotiate with the United States what is at least an understanding that you're leaving your options for peace open. You're giving maximum room for the Palestinians, to build an infrastructure. You're not endangering your own security. But because you're not going to settle, you're very clearly sending the message that two states is the objective. And the people on the right who can't take that final step. Mm-hmm. They can't say we'll pull back on settlement.
Some of them.
Some of them. And therefore, what they are doing is bringing into play ultimate arrangements that are simply not going to be democratic. What's going to happen is...
It won't happen.
What's going to happen is...
What won't happen?
People are
They want to
already...
annex.
People are already giving up on the two-state solution. It's happening on campus now, by the way. People who think that somehow that, this is just an abstract danger for the future. When you go to campus now, you argue with people who very emphatically say, I'm for a democratic state, for everybody. For everybody. We're going to start seeing it in Europe. What the Palestinians are going to do, beginning tomorrow, by the way, beginning now, is they're going to go to the UN.
Yeah.
They're going to start joining these various UN bodies. They're going to wait for a shift in opinion, which has already started in a significant way among the Europeans, even with American support. There's only so much America can do in the international realm, ultimately, to protect them. And this is going to create a very difficult and problematic situation. I'm saying preempt that. Make a deal with the arrangements. Work. You can't do that without settlement. Without a settlement deal. Make an arrangement to preempt it, to say, we're keeping the options open, our hands are clean. When the Palestinians are ready for peace, we're going to be ready.
I disagree with the timing. The objective, I agree with.
Okay. The issue becomes, if tomorrow the government seriously announced no more settlements outside.
It's out of the blocks.
Yeah. Only vertical, no horizontal growth. Okay. Do you think that would incentivize the Palestinians not to go to the United Nations?
No.
Look,
Because if they're going to go
Make no
anyway,
difference,
you don't win.
Look, the key is key is America. I don't happen to believe the Palestinians are important in the sense that I don't know that what we're going to do is going to impact them. But, you know, part of the Israeli mindset seems to be that somehow magically America's always going to be with us.
No,
But that absolutely is not the reality. The real danger
I
by
agree.
the now is not from the Republicans. It's not from the Democrats. It's from the Republicans.
no.
We now have an isolationist candidate by the name of Rand Paul, who a year ago I would have said has absolutely no chance of being the candidate or the president. Put him out of your mind. He will be a serious candidate. I still don't think he's going to get the nomination, but I have to tell you, I am less sure now than I was before. You have the ZOA and Caroline Glick lining up behind his proposals. The ultimate irony. His campaign ads, I'm telling you this, as sure as we sit here, are going to feature statements from Mort Klein and Caroline Glick.
You're joking.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. They have endorsed.
Very hard to believe.
They have endorsed his latest positions on the Palestinians.
Yes, he's come out with
They're-
Israel exclusion.
I think your initial take on him
I think
still is
that-
right. He's not going to be the
He's
candidate.
not going to be that.
I don't think
There
so.
is isolationist sentiment in this country. As I said before,
That's
Obama
true.
is not unpopular on
Okay.
the grounds of foreign
But
policy.
wait, I want to pick up on what you're saying here in this way. Again, for all of the things my overriding criticism of one theme, of the overriding theme of the book, My Promised Land, by Ari Shavit, he also has, again, many wonderful parts of the book. One of the things he talks about is how there seems to be, what you're talking about here as well, Eric, an erosion of support on the American scene in general, slow, and the other thing is, will it affect campus life? And what he writes is, enlightened Jews in America and Europe are ashamed of Israel. He's talking about both the occupation and the settlement policy. And his point is that sometimes Israel should adopt policies, which may not be intrinsically, morally an obligation, but they do affect public opinion. And that public opinion does matter. It matters throughout the world, and it matters most in the United States. And that sometimes Israel should take a position, even if it is not going to mean that Palestinians will say yes. They'll still say no. But the world will see Israel in a different light if Israel makes certain overtures and decisions on its own. Does that resonate with you at all?
We have to be realistic. Of course, first of all, I think he overstates the problem right now. I think support for Israel is stronger than he credits it to be. So I'm not in a state of panic right now. I think the broader issue, the longer-term prospects are troubling. And does Israel have to be realistic? Of course it has to be realistic. Israel is utterly dependent for its survival on the support of the United States of America. And therefore, you have to act in such a way where that support will be maintained, not only with the masses, evangelical Christians, I suggest, are becoming less important, but also with political elites. When the defense minister of Israel, who's the senior member of the government, apart from the prime minister, issues these personal attacks. The Secretary of State. It makes no difference whether or not he's right or wrong.
I agree with you.
Substance.
It was a
Absolutely none. It was a vicious personal attack, and then he really refused to apologize for it, and the Prime Minister didn't come forward. Those things are noted someplace. They're put aside. Alienates not only the Secretary of State, but the bureaucracy, and proud Americans who somehow just don't like their country being attacked. But more broadly, do you have to be realistic and sometimes make decisions that you might not otherwise make? And the answer is, of course. And Zionists have always done that. I mean, Ben-Gurion agreed to a partition that really didn't make any sense, but he realized it was the thing that he had to do at the moment.
What do you think on this? Do you think at some points in time, the decisions Israel makes should not be motivated entirely on whether there is intrinsic right or wrong, but that public opinion does matter?
Look, I think it's very difficult to deal with this in a hypothetical situation because they are both interrelated. Public opinion does count, but at the same time, Israel, I'm very objective in this, I know. Israel has been consistently on the side of the angels overall, and the others have been consistently on the side of the devil when it comes to war and peace and all the rest of it. It hasn't got us anywhere. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is, and the problem of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism is not a problem of our making. It's far more complex than that. It is linked up with anti-Semitism. Genuine anti-Semitism is linked up with the Arab issue and their influence in world affairs. It is linked up with cultural traditions. It's all very, very complicated. And just by behaving in a certain manner, we're not going to change the pot. But I still think we have to take it into account. And sometimes you're being very pragmatic by doing the right thing in PR terms that may not be directly correct. You have to weigh it all up, what I'm saying is. There's no black and white answer to that.
I could have you at this table for hours and hours. Unfortunately, the clock does have power of its own. I can't thank the two of you enough. You know how, Eric, I love you, and it's wonderful to always have you. I want you here all the time. Thank you. Continue the great work you're doing. Kol Tuv v'Hatzlacha, just fabulous. Izzy, I adore you. One of the greatest things that's happened to me because of Shalom TV is that I've become part of your life and you've become a part of mine. There's no one like you on the Israeli scene. You continue to write, continue to speak, and continue to help us understand more of the subtleties that are going on in Israeli life and Jewish life today. Kol Tuv v'Hatzlacha.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being with you again, Mark.
Thank you. That was our conversation. Izzy Lieberman, columnist for the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom, whose column you can receive online by signing up at Word from Jerusalem. And Eric Yaffi, columnist for Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, Huffington Post. And again, you can read him at ericyaffi.com. And I understand you can also sign up to receive his blogs on your computer as well. I hope you enjoyed their take on the various issues that you've heard them discuss. Each of them has enormous insight, and it's wonderful to be able to see the nuance of difference of opinion, and at the same time there is an overall context that they both bring, and it's not only supportive of Israel, but supportive of the Jewish future and the state of Israel and what we're doing here in American Jewish life. And it really is extraordinary to have the two of you. You know, when you talk about what Shalom TV is all about, it's what the two of you are. And I have enormous regard for both of you. And it is always, it's just a privilege for me to be able to bring you and your thoughts to the audience and to be able to have you dialogue in front of us. It's a tremendous gift you both give.
Great to be with you, Mark.
Thank you.
As always, I'd love to know anything you have to say about the thoughts you've heard from Izzy Lieberman and Eric Yaffi. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. LChayim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
LChayim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.